Cool. Let me just share my screen.
I'll just be introducing you first.
Sure. Yes.
Yeah. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the session today. ESAL presents to you Design and Implementation by Ms. Priyal Parekh, who's here with us all the way from the United States. It's said that design thinking is the glue that binds all disciplines. And to elaborate on this, today we have Priyal ma'am. I'd now like to invite Tisha Pahuja to introduce you, ma'am.
Ms. Priyal Parekh is a graduate from the Parsons School of Design, and she currently works as a design innovator at EAI Technologies. Being proficient in Adobe Suites, HTML5, JavaScript, and many more, she has also freelanced as a branding designer for startups and small enterprises. Ms. Priyal is also an alum of Jai Hind College. We welcome you, ma'am, and thank you for taking out your time to be with us today. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you. You don't have to call me ma'am. You can please feel free to refer to me by my first name. I'm gonna share my screen and then start. Okay, can you guys see the screen?
Yes.
Cool. So I've already been introduced, but my name is Priyal Parekh. I'm here to talk about design and implementation. And what I want to talk about a little today is obviously about myself, introduce myself. The design process that I've experienced over time at my job, present a short case study. So I put theory into a little more perspective, and I'm just not giving a lecture out here. A lot of what I will cover might have been covered in some of your classes too. So you're going to be aware of things I talk about. And then I will, at the end, share two of my favorite books that have inspired me in my journey so far. So let's start. Oh, sorry. Yeah. So I'm an alum of Jai Hind. I started my journey at BMS back in 2010. It's been a long time. And after Jai Hind, I started working at Ernst & Young as a risk analyst straight out of college. This was I was one of the placements from college itself. And at Ernst & Young, I had a lot of fun with the team I worked with. And it was very analytically challenging, but it lacked the creative challenges that I was looking forward to. And that sort of drove me to start looking at other career options. And as design and art have always been a part of my life growing up, that was something I started focusing on. And I took a year off after EY. I looked at schools in India, everywhere that would accept students with a diverse background, not necessarily from the design school. And that's how I got admission at Parsons. And I landed up at the MFA in Design and Technology program, which initially when I joined the school, I thought I was going to focus only on interaction design, having the graphic design background, teaching myself some of those skills. I was looking forward to having a very design heavy program. And to my surprise, there was also a bit of coding and programming. The interesting thing at Parsons was I wasn't limited to just one set of things in design, but more so I was able to use my skills from BMS, from EY, bring all of those soft skills into what I was doing and become a UX designer. So after Parsons, I landed up at EAI Technologies, where I work as a UX designer, but my company likes to call it design innovator. And I've been there for 4 years now. Worked with more than 10 clients across a lot of fields, like industries like healthcare, supply chain, logistics, cybersecurity. And it's been very interesting because I get to learn the business processes and use that understanding in the way we design things and create products for them. So what is UX? When typically you hear someone's a UX designer, you think about websites or apps that are being built. You're designing something that someone's using on the phone or an iPad on the laptop or something. It's usually the first thing that comes to your mind is a digital experience. But that's not true. You're not just building a web app or a website. It's more about the entire experience of using it, where you're using it, how you're using it. It's very important. Your user is not just, an anonymous being who's going to interact with something you're building, but they're very at the center of the entire process for you. And that for me was very interesting because initially when I looked at interaction design, I only thought about designing the website or making something beautiful and putting it out there. But when I learned what UX really is, it was mind-blowing. A lot of the business practices that were taught in college or we think we're going to go out and use were actually put to use in design as well. So for me, both my worlds sort of came together at Parsons and at my job. This quote by Don Norman really he's kind of the person who coined the term user experience designer. And his quote explains very well what user experience is. It's really your entire surrounding. It's not just the one thing you're interacting with. And it also feeds into like some of the other concepts you will hear somewhere outside, like universal design or accessible design, inclusive design, which means you have to focus on things like a person with different abilities who's using your app or your website. It's not always just one kind of user that you're targeting. It depends on the kind of business you have, the idea you have. And so the design process it looks very simple on paper, where yes, you start with an idea and you research it. You sort of ideate more, you build up on it, you start prototyping it, you test it out, and you have something that goes out into the market. It sounds easy, it sounds straightforward, but it's actually not. It's kind of a loop. And depending on what phase of your business you're in, all of these steps are always a part of it. So you may start with the main business idea that you have, where you're still discovering what you want to put out there. You're defining your problem space. Then when you're ideating, it's very important to understand your user base. Prototyping has its own, I wouldn't say rules, but it has its own sort of guidelines that we usually follow in the design world. So going a little more into detail with that, obviously, before you start into any of this, one of the most important things is the project management. And this plays a very key role in how any company works, or even the design process for that matter for a team is. You might have heard of a lot of those the popular management methods like Kanban, Agile, Waterfall. Kanban was introduced by Toyota and has been around for years. Agile is a slightly more newer concept where it's very iterative and you're constantly adapting to the needs. Waterfall is more linear, where yes, it goes very step by step and by the book. There's less navigation or movement in the project based on requirements that come ad hoc. And so how you decide to run your project impacts the entire design process. Every single decision-making step that it comes in is affected by this, because either you go so by the book and linear that you have to go step by step, you can't introduce things. And the 5 steps that I showed you in the design process earlier are followed very linearly. Whereas Agile, Kanban, they allow you to be a little more flexible about this, and all of that eventually affects your project pace. So how you do this definitely depends on the company you're in, but a lot of it also depends on the team you're in. It's not necessarily, an entire company works the same way. It depends on the company. There are a lot of factors that play into this. And you might, when we theoretically learn about this, it's very, you have one process name and there's a specific way to the process. But in real life, what was interesting for me was the fact that Agile, Scrum, Kanban, these weren't ever 3 individual processes that a company would work with, but they were really all intermixed in a way that the project would work very, very dynamically. So the first step, based on whatever project management methodology you choose, is usually to discover and define your idea. if you're in a startup or you're just starting out your business, usually your first step is to figure out what the business is going to be about. But if you're already an actively running business, then usually this is a little smaller problem space where you go feature-wise, where you want to see how to either expand your business or improve the product. So you're brainstorming product ideas. A lot of the methods for product brainstorming, like you might have read about, would be the usual brain netting, brain mapping. People put up post-its of ideas where they vote on them. But what has been a key factor for my journey has been a lot of feedback from users, because I work on a lot of existing products. And that's something you only get to experience when you're on the field at the job. It's not something that you've really experienced much while you're in college learning about these methods. And so it was very interesting to understand how a user's already been using something and then come back with that feedback and brainstorm ideas to improve something. And this would usually define the scope of what we're working on and drive the rest of the design process. So yes, there's a lot of ideas that come in, but usually it's very important to figure out exactly what you want to work on and prioritize that. Like, yes, there's always 10 things that make an app better or a website better, but prioritizing that helps go forward and focus on smaller problem spaces. So this is where analysis plays a very, very big part. We usually work with business analysts at my company who will help us through this process. They speak to the customer, they understand what needs to be done. Sometimes I get to play a part in it too, so it's interesting because I get the analytical challenges that I'm looking for. Once we know the problem space we're working in, it's understanding our user is always important. You have to understand who your user is in terms of not just demographics or where your user is going to be or what your product is and how they're going to be interacting with it. But you also have to find the lowest common denominator you're designing for. So assume something like WhatsApp, right? When that came out, they had to not only cater to people who are very tech savvy and have been using sort of these messenger programs for a long time, but they also had to make sure that it catered to people who were using this for the first time, different age groups. And how you understand that user is usually creating a persona. So you're creating this fictional user that you think is going to use your product, and I empathize with them. So it's not just putting yourself in place of that user, but it's identifying who's actually going to be using it and very, very specifically identifying your user base. So this helps you understand all the different phases that they're going to be using the product in, the surroundings and the environment, whether they're going to be indoors, outdoors, whether it's something they're going to be using when they're under duress, or it's something that, it's just for entertainment that they're going to be using it. All those kind of things matter a lot. Empathizing with your user is what makes user experience so much more interesting. It's not just putting something that's beautiful or aesthetic out there. So once you know your user, you've created these personas, your next step is to ideate and sort of create a storyboard or a journey for them. Whenever any app or design website is created, usually you have a landing page, like a homepage or something that you come on, and there are fixed flows where certain buttons lead you to certain pages. What we do in this step of the process is really identify that. So we create a sitemap, you create storyboards, even empathy maps. So what are their moods when they're clicking a button or when they've landed at that page, how they feel about what they're seeing, making those guesses based on the user personas, and then creating use cases of why they're actually coming to your site or app. So what this helps you with is sort of understand why you're creating something. So it's not just creating something for the heck of it. It's giving you perspective into it, and it drives how you style something then. So the entire aesthetic of the app is nothing but a combination of all the use cases and the personas. it's not, like, it's not just making something that has a button that takes you somewhere else, but it's also strategically placing that button so it's accessible. When you come on the homepage, usually the first thing that you see on any website would be the navigation bar at the top, which gives you all the pages or the main pages that it links to. This kind of, practice of having the navigation always at the top didn't just come about one day, but it's something that, people have identified is easy to use. It's something people look forward to. It's based on a lot of research, and creating empathy maps and storyboards does give you that insight if it's a brand new product that you're creating. Once you've got your style guide set, what you start doing is prototyping. Prototyping has a lot of different ways you can go about with it. So one of the methods is a rough paper prototype where you can cut it out, sort of create very 2D graphics. And actually, when someone's clicking a menu or something, you can have an actual paper that opens up instead of digitally dropping a menu down, for instance. And so sort of if you see in this image, I have a phone, but then what I'm doing is replacing all the look and feel of every page on it. And this helps with testing, because I can, even before my product is released, I can put this in front of a user and get them to play and interact with it by tapping something, moving a page out of or in, and seeing what the reaction is like. Another version of this, usually after you've done some sort of paper prototyping or whiteboarding also sometimes, is when you create low fidelity mocks. So you're just sort of placing things in the layouts you want them to be. And again, you can go back and test. You see how people are interacting, where they're tapping, what they're clicking. And this would give you insight into whether you've actually placed something important where it should be, or the main purpose of whatever you're designing is hidden away. And then the final sort of prototyping is a high fidelity prototype where you're trying to be as pixel perfect as you can to imitate what it's going to be when it's actually built. Sometimes we jump directly to high fidelity prototypes. Sometimes, it's directly you're going and building it out without even building even creating the high fidelity prototypes. The decision to do that depends upon how much you're testing, what stage of the business process you're in, and how much access do you have to your users for testing as well. Usually after prototyping, we go back to the empathy maps and the storyboards, and we make sure that what we've done aligns with what we expected. And it gives us that little breathing time to make sure that we're building something that's meaningful, that's usable, and it's not just something that we're going to have to come back and rework on immediately because it may not work. So it's a lot of critical thinking once you're done prototyping before you actually go into the business, the building part of it. And then when you're going into building the prototype, a lot of what matters is less of the design and more of like the technological aspect of it. So where you're building it, how you're building it, what technology you're using for it. And when I talk about technology, I don't mean just something that's digital. This could be anything. It can be a wearable device, like an iWatch, like the Apple Watch, for instance. It could be clothing. It could be any physical device, like even furniture, for instance, can be prototyped, built out, tested, all of that. So tech stack, yes. The first thing that comes to your mind is digital coding technology, but it doesn't have to be limited to that. Once you figure that out, you actually go into building it. The next step is QA testing and bug fixing. QA testing, quality assurance testing, is usually an individual who's not been part of this entire process at all. We give that person the use cases, so they get to see what we've intended to do, and then they actually go start using the website. And it's interesting because it's a type of testing like you would with the users, but they're not your intended user. They're just making sure that things work the right way. Styles are consistent. You know, your forms, for instance, if you've created something in a web app, does not break when you're trying to save it. All those kinds of things. And they'll file tickets that tell us what we need to fix if something's broken. At this stage, again, yes, we do some amount of user testing. So that's either, you know, you have someone sit there and actually use the app you've built out, and you're seeing what they're tapping on the actual site. It's not just a paper prototype or a mock-up that they're interacting with, but it's the actual website that's fully functional. And so they click through all of that, and you see what they're doing. If the intended workflows are the way they're navigating through it. What we also sometimes do is A/B testing. A/B testing is a little different from user testing because you don't have one user who's just going through a single app. In A/B testing, we sort of create two versions of something. And then you randomly have different people come and use it. And then eventually we go ahead with only one of the two ideas, obviously, depending on the feedback that we get. After developing, there is the final release to production, but usually the process doesn't end there. We go back to the drawing board as soon as something's out, because there's always improvements, there's enhancements, there's 99% of the times there's a bug that's pending. You never clear your tickets out, even after your product is out, people are actually using it. So yeah, this process really doesn't ever end once you're in it. That was all very theoretical, what I covered. I didn't go into too much detail about some of the things because I feel like your classes or a lot of information out there on Google already does cover it. So I don't want to bore you all, but I can't share what I actually do at work for confidentiality reasons, but I will walk you through a short case study of my thesis at Parsons, which was also very, very heavily around this entire design process. And what was interesting for me was I actually created a business proposal for this at the end as part of my dissertation. So my thesis was called Embrace. And the first thing that we were made to do was create a concept statement. So this does nothing but brings the entire define and discover process into a single sentence. The goal is to be able to define whatever you're designing or you're problem solving for into one sentence, which answers 5 questions. Who, what, how, where, and why. So the fact that I was creating a fashionable alternative is the what. Easing the lower back pain is why. Female millennials is who. Non-specific causes is where, what, and performing daily activities is where. If you can answer these 5 questions in a single sentence, your idea is something that's worth solving or going ahead with. What it helps you do is narrow the focus or the scope such that you can think logically. So the next step is obviously I had to go research why. So I had an idea, right? I defined what my idea was, but I had to discover whether what I wanted to do made sense. And so I had to go research, find statistics, things that backed my idea, that made it sound more logical. And a lot of it was, yes, going to Google and reading, but some of it was also talking to people around me. I was this idea stemmed because I had a lower back pain issue. And I discovered that not only me, but so many people our age, in our generation, suffer from it for various reasons. And so I could come back and say, yes, I've done my research. I know this works. This is a problem area that's not very looked into. And so then what my next step was to identify who would actually use something that I wanted to build. I had to not only figure an idea, but figure who would benefit from the idea. And I created user personas. People, and a lot of this was inspired from people around me who've, I've spoken to, who had these kind of issues or not had these kind of issues, but feel like it could help them, every now and then, because it may not be chronic, but back pain just happens to everyone at some point. And this, a lot of identifying my user personas and understanding who and where and how would use it drove the design aspect, the actual design of the device. And so I went on to storyboarding to take it one step further and not just identify the users, but see in what scenarios they'd actually use it. Use cases help understand why someone's using what you're building. And so it gives you a sort of direction to move ahead with the design. So you storyboard, you come up with at least 5 use cases of why or when they'd be using this. And it also drives your site map. So I started prototyping. What I was building was a physical device that also had a website for customization and purchasing this stuff. And the fun part of this was I got to learn a lot of skills I never had. And it combined my childhood dream of wanting to be a fashion designer, which I obviously gave up. I got to learn a lot about how business is a big part of design, because I had a business proposal at the end of it, if this were ever released. And I got to also learn about wearable technology. So I never actually incorporated a lot of elements, but learning how electronics can be a part of clothing was very interesting for me in this phase of prototyping and researching. And then I actually once I built something that could be, tested by someone wearing it, I had someone actually wear it and walk around for the day to come and give me feedback of what they thought about it. And then when I had the website actually built out, also I had people come and, test it, play with it, just watch how they interacted with it. It wasn't, it was purely qualitative in this, even without questions or of any sort. So I just had a camera set up. I would see how people were interacting and then go back and study that. There was no conversation. And primarily one of the reasons for doing that was to see if it's easy enough to navigate through the website I've built, because I'm not actually going to be talking to people who are using it eventually. And then I had my final thesis show where we presented for 3 days. So this was kind of the release or the final step of the whole process for me, right? Where everything came together. I spoke to a lot of people outside of my school who came to see this, who had never seen something like this or had interacted with the website before. So it was interesting to see them too. And those are kind of the final users that you test with that you don't have access to in the beginning. So yeah, design is messy. It's very messy. It's not linear as it sounds sometimes. If you go back and Google design is messy, is a very famous conversation that's been ongoing in the design field these days, because a lot of people think design is messy only in the research phase, because there's so much you have to think about. Your problem space when you start with is so big, you don't know what you're doing with. It's tough to sometimes narrow down to what you want to really do. But that's not entirely true. Your process is messy at any stage, at any time. You have bursts of clarity where you think you're going in the right direction. So when you start this, researching your idea, you think that there is so much research, you get overwhelmed, then suddenly you sorted through all of that, you have an idea, there's some amount of clarity. When you start creating user personas, you're empathizing with them, you're creating their journeys. Again, it's messy because you don't really know how it's going to be or where you want them to be. So there's so many options that you could design in how you could design their journey, how you want them to use something you're building, what you want them to feel. there's so much to think about in terms of the environment they're going to be using it in, because, you know, if it's a web app that they're using outside in the sun, for instance, you don't want colors to be such that it blinds them. Like if someone's using their phone while walking on the street and it's something, you know, that's almost blinding them with the glare, they're not going to use it. So thinking about that while you're prototyping is very important, which again, you know, makes it a very, very extensive process. And then there's this moment of clarity when you've actually got something that you feel is good enough, you start testing it, things are going great until, you know, you've again started building it out. And then you're back to like the whiteboard for a lot of reasons. So it's not, you know, very straightforward once you have an idea. There's always these ups and downs. And it's interesting because it's a lot like, you know, running a business, yes. Obviously there's ups and downs with business, but a lot of the business is driven by design these days. And so they sort of go hand in hand where one doesn't really survive without the other. If you don't have help, design help internally, people will go and outsource. They will find external companies that do this. And what's interesting is tech companies too, which used to be all about software before, are now adapting a more design-centered approach as well, because they've seen the benefits of having a more holistic approach to building stuff. So finally, two of my favorite books that I always will go to when I'm stuck in my design process is The Design of Everyday Things by Don Norman and Design for Real Life. Like I said at the beginning, you know, user experience design is not just about building the specific product, but it's also about the entire system around it or the environment around it. And I like these two books a lot because they're not focused just on the digital aspect, but they talk about very real life designing problems too. Like one of my most favorite examples, I think, from Design of Everyday Things is the door. Like we all have doors in our house. A door is something we interact with on a daily basis in our homes, outside our homes, anywhere you go, right? And it sounds like a very simple thing, but have you ever tried like pushing a door, but you're actually supposed to pull it, or pulling a door that you're actually supposed to push? Like that's bad design if you're doing that. And that shouldn't be happening, but because things just look pretty, sometimes we leave it like that. And user experience is solving that, where you want form, but you also want functionality. You know, you're not really compromising one over the other. So if you're interested in understanding more about user experience, I would recommend going and reading one of these books. That was all I had. If you guys have any questions, feel free to ask.
Thank you, ma'am. That was a great session. We will be having a couple of questions people will be asking in the chat box. So before, okay, we already have one. Shan is asking, what does it mean when we say design thinking is iterative?
Sorry, can you repeat the last part?
What does it mean when we say design thinking is iterative?
Design thinking is iterative because, like I said, the process is not linear. Even though you have 5 steps, you're looping through them. So, you know, you might start with the defining your problem space, but when you get to prototyping, sometimes you have to go back to the whiteboard and start researching. Or if you've gone and released something, you might have to go back and define a new problem space so you can improve the product. So even within those 5 steps, there are multiple loops. I'm just going to go back to one of my slides. Let's see. Yeah. So if you see, you know, between the ideating and releasing, I've written iteration and improvement. You're never really going step by step in any of these. You could be in the building phase and you realize that, you know, something that you designed is completely wrong and you might have to go back to prototyping. Or if you're prototyping something and you realize, you know, one of your users you've defined is wrong or not needed, you have to go back to the ideate and empathize phase. And that's really what it means to be iterative.
All right. There's another question. It says, how do you make design thinking and analytical research coexist?
That's a great question. It depends on how your team functions. At least for me, a lot of that comes together because when we're in the discover and define stage, right, we're understanding what we want to build. It's very important to know how to research or the methods you have. But again, it's not just using one method for research. So it's not just doing a qualitative survey or asking very targeted questions, but it's a little bit of everything. You have to do a lot of analytical thinking because there's so much that you can solve, even for a very defined problem space. So that's where I think analysis, it drives design. And if you're not sure about how you want to define something or design something, sorry, I meant that other way. If you're not sure about how to, like, what requirements to get, you're never going to get to the designing phase. So when you have requirements from someone saying they want to build something, it's really a lot of the analysis goes into how you want to prioritize that, and those priorities will drive the design discussion further. I don't know if that answered your question.
There's another question that says, in the entire process of design thinking, what roles does technical tools play, BCG matrix, etc.? Is it necessary to know all of them?
It's not necessary to know all of them. It does depend on the company you're working with and the company you're working for, your clients as well. Some companies have very, very defined processes and methods that they like using. Some companies are a little more flexible and open to seeing what works best for that entire process. I guess knowing about them is important, but knowing them necessarily isn't always good to read up and be aware of things. All of this, there's so much constantly changing in this sector. Design thinking as a sector it's been around for a very long time, but it's very up and coming. So the developments of how things are happening, the mixing of business and design, the different processes of both of those coming together is a very recent thing that people have started focusing on because they've seen the benefits of it. Like SWOT analysis has been around for the longest time, but it's not necessary that you're going to go and use it every single time. A lot of the methods you use depend on what you're working on and who you're working with.
Thank you, ma'am. There's another question. Someone's asking, one needs to be artistically inclined to be a design thinker?
Not necessarily.
No, not necessarily.
Design is not just, creating something beautiful or something that, looks very pretty. Design today encompasses a much larger surface in the business area, where you have designing an entire business, which means the project management methodologies, how you can combine some of them and use, a mix of those is also design. A lot of analysis can be combined with design because your research methodologies, your testing methodologies are quite similar in both the sectors. So you don't have to necessarily be an artist or creatively inclined for it, but it does help if you have a good eye for design when you're in the prototyping and building phase, I guess. A lot of it today is also from experience. So like the developers I work with, for instance, they didn't go to design school. They're not, building, they're not designing the front end or the UI that we're interacting with always. But they do come up with good ideas just because we all use so many different apps or websites that we interact with. Sometimes just learning, keeping your eyes open and learning from your surroundings also helps.
Ma'am, you said that design is messy, and when you're in the stage of designing, so how do you know that you don't go off track while you're ideating and thinking, and you're following a certain path and not going haywire with designing?
That's very interesting. I don't think there's like a definitive answer for that. What does help is identifying your problem space. Sometimes, yes, you might even go and build and release, something that doesn't work, but that's part of the iterative process where you're going to get feedback and come and correct it. The good thing about this design process is once something is out there released, there's always a way to improve it. Even something that, when you release it, it seems like the best thing that you've released. Like take Apple, for instance, right? They release an iPhone every year and something is always better than the previous year, even though they say this is the best we've come up with so far. Yeah, so it's messy and you may go off track sometimes. You might be on the correct path. It helps to have people that you work with who also are, of a similar mindset, or the people your clients are working with will sometimes guide you if, they think it's not right. There's a lot of factors that play into it. And it's different when you're working with a company versus, you have your own startup and you're trying to design your own product, your problem space and product space.
Right.
That's the one good thing about design is it's all very dynamic.
Now we have one more question if you have the time to take it.
Yeah.
Can we take more questions? Yeah.
Yeah,
I'm asking, at what point do the real constraints such as budgets, capacity, etc., come into the process?
Much before you even start any of this. Usually, a company has these decisions made before they dive into any of this. So I work at a company where we work for other companies. So when we're not building anything that we release for ourselves, but we really build apps and websites that other companies use for their end users. So for us, a lot of the budget is driven by our clients. And the capacity planning is done by my company, but all of that happens before we actually get into problem solving. Those things are usually sort of clarified beforehand.
All right. I think that was all from our side.
I have a question. Hi, Priya.
Hi, ma'am.
How are you, Priyal? I'm so sorry. I had an EY pre-placement talk, so that got extended. So I missed the first part of it, although I was looking forward. So Priyal, I have a question is, as you know, students, when they do a lot of research and they just feel like going for research, because somewhere in the design thinking, the first part is the research part when they have problem or something they want to address. What kind of tips you would like to give them? Because if they do something wrong right at the initial part, I think whether they build a good prototype or whatever it is, they will always have a problem. So if you can, and knowing the kind of students we have and the kind of things they do, because you've been a part of system a couple of years ago, and how the research is conducted generally when you look at it.
There's different phases of it. A lot of it does start with qualitative and quantitative analysis on Google. Whatever your problem space is, you want to get some facts and figures to know that you're on the right track with what you want to do. But if this usually helps when you're starting out, a brand new product or a business where you want to go and do research about the industry you're in, the sector you're in. And with Google today, there's a lot of reports out there that will give you this, very specific data that you need to understand. The second step is empathizing. So you want to understand who your users are. And part of it is creating personas where, you have this image of someone you want to design for, but then you also want to actually go and talk to people in person, ask them very targeted questions and see what their reaction is to that, their feedback is. And a lot of the qualitative, quantitative, Google analysis can be combined with these targeted questions, because yes, there's facts and figures out there, but you also want to back that up with some actual conversations. It always helps to make sure that, what you've read online does have some real life resemblance. So surveys, actual, like questionnaires, conversations, very open conversations, all of those are some great tools. And even if it's, just going and talking to a family member or a friend or someone you've randomly met, it doesn't always have to be like talking to 100 people. But yes, start with Google, do your research, and then talk to people. I think that those two things are very important.
One last thing, Priya, if you have 1 more minute, I know it's like, what is the time out there?
It's almost 1:20 at night.
Okay, so last 1 more minute. No, I know you have office also next day. Any important thing when we talk about empathy mapping, if you can just tell the students, because we have design thinking students also who are doing live project, and any important thing if you look at it as an empathy mapping when they do observations and all.
Yeah, there's I think there's some great tools out available on Google, like in terms of the 4 quadrants of empathy mapping. So you want, one part is talking to them and basically doing some analysis of their answers to see how they feel. One is observing how they're interacting with something, or what their expressions are, and taking those soft cues. One part of it is what you want them to feel when they're going to be interacting with what you're building. And so creating a user journey and then seeing what emotions you want to generate in them at what stage of that journey. So if we take a website, for instance, right, when they come to the home page of the website, what is your intention? Versus, what the user, what is your intention versus what you think the user is going to feel. So are they coming in when they're angry? Are they coming in when they're happy? Are they coming in when they're bored? And then taking those emotions and moving forward with every step of the process of how you want to, you want them to experience what you're building is important. And then whether you're building something that, you want people with different abilities to be using, whether it's very, very technical and, it's only for a limited set of users who know exactly what they're doing. Identifying all of that at the very beginning is a lot of what empathy mapping it helps. So there's some great tools out there. If you Google that, will give you sort of a layout of how to set that information. I can share some of those tools and send the links to you.
Yeah, Priyal, I mean, one last question. Okay, you have questions flowing in. That's Priyal Parekh. So yeah, let's take 1 or 2 last questions. Priyal, I mean, that's okay with you? Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely, no problem.
Okay. Yeah, Ayushi, you can go ahead.
Yes, ma'am. So, ma'am, I had a question that in terms of empathy mapping, like, don't you feel like we need to keep doing it again and again, because people's emotions as to what they say, think, do, they keep changing at different phases of their purchasing journey, right? Or like, even just identifying the product. So they go through a lot of emotions as a whole till they actually reach a conclusion. So do you suggest that we keep making different empathy maps as and when like they go through different phases?
It always helps to validate what you came up with. I don't think you necessarily have to reiterate the same, the same story every time. But what you will start to see eventually is patterns in that, right? So once you've created the empathy map the first time, when you're prototyping, when you're testing, you're constantly going to get people to interact with what you're doing, right? It helps to validate. Because sometimes, like, one of the questions was, how do you know you're completely off track? That validating will tell you how off track you are sometimes. Sometimes you might be completely on point. So there's tweaks, which is what makes this process so iterative. And it's a loop, basically, right? You're constantly going back to make sure that you're on the right track. But I don't think you have to reinvent the wheel every time. Sometimes you might have to correct and redo because you're completely wrong. But sometimes it's also, you've identified that some of the user personas you've created may not be the people you're actually catering for. And so what you've been looking at might not be exactly, what you need to continue with. It's an iterative process, and that's why it's not as linear as this looks.
Okay, thank you, ma'am.
Dhruv, you have a question?
Yes, ma'am. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Hi, Priyal ma'am, and thank you for the session. It was pretty insightful. And like, ma'am, you said that you should use Google tools, to kind of survey, and you should use different kind of tools to observe your audience, your target audience. Mm-hmm. My question was like, right now in this situation, how do you think one should go about observing the audience? Knowing the fact that if we use, say, for example, Google Forms to have a survey, people don't fill it with the intention, or people don't fill it with what they actually feel about that question. They just fill it for the sake of it. So how do you analyze or survey people in this situation for design thinking on a project?
It's tough. I don't think there's one definite answer, but I think what you have to keep in mind is whether it's right now where you can't actually observe someone, or even when you can observe someone, there's always a margin of error when you're doing surveys. People do filter what they say a lot of times. So I don't think doing a survey is it should be the only means of researching. Surveys should be one part of it. If you can get access, then talking to someone would also help, because sometimes conversations that are not very specific questions will give you more insight into your user than asking specific questions does.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you.
So I think that brings to the end of the session, Ashna.
Yes, ma'am.
So Priyal, it's my honor and privilege, I would say, that I am formally giving you a vote of thanks. You have been a great student when you were in Jai Hind. I know the way you have helped a lot of other students, and the kind of work you have done even when you were in Jai Hind College as holding key positions in different societies and cells, and it was very, very, and I was sharing with some of the students, and I'm so happy that pandemic has given this opportunity to get connected to our alumni who are sitting in different geographical locations, and are coming back to Jai Hind and helping our students, the entire ecosystem. So thank you very much, Priyal. And really, I'm amazed to see the kind of work you are doing as a UI UX and a design innovator. I mean, this is a skill, and it's not that easy to be in this kind of an area. So, Priyal, I joined half of the presentation, but I could see the entire case study. I mean, you were talking about the back pain, and the entire stuff was really, really nice. And thank you very much, Priyal, for at such a short notice accepting this invitation, coming back to Jai Hind virtually. Hope to see you very soon in a normal environment. And I know how committed you are when you actually sit with any such work, because I've seen you working for a lot of people. And I still remember, and that's what I would like to say, is her batchmate used to say, we don't have to worry if Priyal is there with us, because she used to teach a lot of students, juniors, seniors, and she was one such student. I remember she got full 100 marks in operations research paper, and that was only one student, and that a university exam. So that's that's the kind of student Priyal was, and I'm sure she's doing very well. God bless you, Priyal. We would like you to have a mentor in our incubation center, which we have started because especially in the area of design thinking, where the startups, if they need some help, they can reach out to you as per your convenience. So that is something we would want more from you, Priyal. Thank you very much, and God bless you.